Hey everyone, welcome to another deck building tech video. Up till now I've basically created sideboard tech videos where I give you ideas and card selections for your sideboards based on what color combinations you're playing in Modern. And I decided to expand this series of videos into different parts or different aspects of deck building. And I think lands is something that confuses most players, most Magic players, confusing to different degrees. I recently put up a poll on my Twitter page, on my Twitter account, asking my followers what if they found land or Manabase Construction difficult or not, and it's been a mixed bag. Some people find it easy, but a lot more people find it confusing or a bit more difficult to put together. So this is a basics video. If you're a seasoned veteran or pro, well, if you're a pro, you're probably not watching a lot of my videos, but if you're a seasoned veteran, you've been playing Magic for a long time, you're relatively comfortable with building your mana bases for your decks, then this video is probably not for you, though hopefully, you'll still get something out of it, and maybe you'll, at the very least, have something to nitpick at, and you could, comment in the comment section down below. But if you're newer to Magic or you're newer to building decks, I think this video is going to be very important to you. I should mention that for the sake of making this easy to consume, I'm gonna skip over the nuances of building a mana base. So I'm gonna be simplifying a lot of things here. I'll be telling you when I'm simplifying them. Just to let you know, I will make a second video at some point in the future where it'll be more advanced concepts around Manabase construction and how different aspects of a deck will affect the lands that you choose and the amount of lands that you have. But for now, let's stick to the basics. So there's 3 sections to this. First section is land selection, second section is land count, and third section is actual Manabase composition, where I'll give you some samples. So let's start with land selection. First, off the top, you have your basics. All right, you got 5 basics. Well, technically 6 with the wastes for colorless production, and this is your bread and butter. It's the best lands in Magic. They are the best lands in Magic, essentially. Okay, well, technically snow-covered basics are the best lands in Magic, if you want to talk about percentages. But, for all intents and purposes, your basics are really important when you're playing a 1-color, 2-color, 3-color, and even a 4-color deck. You most likely are going to have some number of basics in your mana base, and these are something that you should not be overlooking. Basics dodge a lot of land-based removal, because a lot of land-based removal targets non-basic lands, so your basics are safe. They're safe from Blood Moon, so on and so forth. So basics are really important, going to be the bedrock of your mana base. Then you got your shock lands, at least in Modern. Shock lands are your dual lands for all intents and purposes. Legacy actually has the real dual lands, original dual lands that have no downside and produce one of 2 colors. In Modern, your best is your shock lands. So they come into play, you could choose to pay 2 life, so they come in untapped, and there you go. you now have access to one of 2 colors to cast your spells. If you don't want to pay the 2 life, that's okay. They come into play tapped, and next turn you untap it. It's not the worst thing in the world. A lot of players will, fetch at the end of their opponent's turn, go get a shock land, not pay the 2 life, and then on their turn they untap, and boom, there we go. So shock lands, once you start having 2 colors and more in your deck, you're definitely going to be playing some number of these. They're the most efficient dual lands in Modern, so keep that in mind. Then you got your actual fetches. So fetches don't produce mana, obviously. They allow you to go get lands that produce mana. Again, very important. There's a reason why shock lands and fetches in particular are very expensive. It's because they are what make decks competitive. They oftentimes will differentiate between a competitive deck and a non-competitive deck is how efficient the mana base is, and fetch lands and shock lands allow you to build very efficient mana bases. Yes, you're paying 1 life for fetches. Yes, you're paying 2 life for shock lands. But your life is a resource at the end of the day. It's not a points counter system where the more life you have, the more likely you are to win, right? I mean, that's something you should definitely understand as a beginner player. And if you've been playing Magic long enough, you already understand that your life is just a resource like anything else. Your life is a resource like your lands are. So paying 2 life or paying 1 life to get proper access to colors to cast your spells is very valuable. So paying 2 life is not really going to be an issue. Paying 1 life to go get a land that you need is not really an issue. Shocks and fetches allow you to do that. And then you got your fast lands, so Spirebluff Canal and other lands like it, where they come into play, and essentially if they're the 3rd land or less that you've played, that you have on the battlefield, they come into play untapped. After that, they come into play tapped, which does suck. which is why you're not necessarily going to play 4 of them, although a lot of decks do. This is my personal opinion. You don't need to play full 4, but they are also important because that's really the only downside. Early game, the first 2-3 lands that you're playing, you have access to them. You know, you're not paying 2 life. That's really important in comparison to shock lands. The one downside, another downside, is that they don't have a basic land type. When I didn't cover that with the shocks, shocks also have basic land types. So if you look at the steam vents, it has an island. It's an island and a mountain. So when you fetch for it, you can, if your fetch says go get an island or a mountain, you can get, steam vents, either with an island or a mountain. Spire Bluff Canal and cards like it, lands like it, don't have basic land types, so you can't fetch for them, and they don't count for anything. They're just a non-basic land, so keep that in mind if that's important in your deck. Then you have your check lands. Pretty sure they're called check lands, like Glacial Fortress, where they check to see if you have a plains or an island, in the case of Glacial Fortress, on the battlefield. And if you do, then they come into play untapped. If you don't, they come into play tapped. So, for example, if you already have a Steam Vents on the battlefield and then you play Glacial Fortress, it'll come into play untapped because Steam Vents is an island and Glacial Fortress is checking for an island. So it's not just checking for basics, it's checking for dual lands like Steam Vents as well. Then you got your Pain lands, one form of Pain land, Corpuscent Forest and cards like it, where you could tap it for 1 colorless mana, and that's free, it doesn't cost you anything, or you could tap it for 1 of 2 colors, and you lose 1 life. So again, this is very painful, obviously, as the game goes on. You don't really want to play too many of these in your deck. They don't have basic land types either, but they can be useful in decks where, for example, colorless mana production is important to you. If it is, then you would definitely want to play some number of these, or if you just want it to be an alternative to a shock land, maybe you can't afford it, for whatever reason, these can be played as well. Or if you just need to round out the numbers, these are also an option, but not something I enjoy playing too much, unless I need the colors, because that 1 life every turn, or 1 life every time you tap it, really adds up a lot more than a shock and a fetch. Then you have your sack lands. That's what I'm calling them. They're also Pain lands. I know they officially have a name, but it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this video. So if you look at Horizon Canopy, you pay 1 life and you add one or the other to your mana pool. 1 green or 1 white, and there's a whole cycle of these. Very similar to a Pain land, so you got to pay to get the color of mana that you need. You can also pay 1 colorless and sacrifice it to draw a card. So, okay. It doesn't produce colorless mana like the Pain lands do, but the added effect here is that if for whatever reason, mid to late game, you've overdrawn on lands, you could always sacrifice this land and draw a card. Maybe you're searching for an answer, and you need to sacrifice it to draw an extra card. You can do that. So there is a benefit to playing cards like these. Plenty of decks pack maybe 1 or 2 cards like it in the deck. Again, this is going to be more your choice. If you're playing a lot of lands, having a couple of these in that mix is probably going to be useful, because if you do flood out, which might happen often, you could always sacrifice it to draw a card. So there is some benefit there. Then recently we had these new dual lands. They're new snow dual lands. Definitely not as good as the dual lands that we had before, which were shocks that I covered before. These are useful if you're playing a snow deck, which isn't very common in Modern at least, but might be common in other formats. They always come into the battlefield tapped, so you have no choice, but they are fetchable because they each have 2 basic land types. So in the case of Snowfield Sinkhole, it's a plains and a swamp, so you can use a fetch to go get it. Very, very useful there. It also counts, if you're playing Glacial Fortress, like the example I was using before. Glacial Fortress is looking for a plains or an island. Snowfield Sinkhole is a plains and a swamp, so it counts. So it works there. But again, these are just options that you have in Modern or in many other formats, not necessarily something that you need unless you need snow lands in particular. Then you got the pathways. Pathways are okay. I think they're okay in 2 color decks. Once they're into 3 color decks, I don't find pathways useful in particular. I think you're better off playing most of the other lands you see on the screen, but they are an option if you are playing 2 lands. If you are playing 2 colors, then these lands are pretty cool. You can't fetch them, which is unfortunate. If you did, I think they'd be broken. But okay, so maybe they are balanced in that sense. But you can choose which side they come into play as, and then they'll only produce that 1 color. But it's useful, if If you're missing one color, then you can choose to come into that side and you fix your mana that way. So pathways are useful in some number. In 2-color decks, I would be weary about playing them in 3-color decks. You could, but maybe at least for the purposes of this video, we won't be covering that. Then you have essentially dozens of other lands, non-basic lands that are played very often in the format. Ghost Quarter, Field of the Dead, Cavern of Souls, Gemstone Mine. Not really going to go through these lands in this particular video because they do change the dynamics of your mana base a bit, and they are special cases, so they're lands I'll cover in a separate video, but I want to mention them. You will see these in many decks, and they are options to you, but they have very specific functions. So again, this is something that we'll cover in an advanced video. So let's move on to land count. Alright, so for the purposes of keeping this simple, I'm going to be going through 2 concepts. Average CMC, so the average converted mana cost of all the spells in your deck, and the amount of ramp spells that you're playing in your deck. Now keep in mind, this is how I build my mana bases, or at least this is the foundation of how I build my mana bases. You or others might do it differently, but I'm presenting it to you in the simple ways that I can and how I do it, not necessarily how other people do it. So let's talk about average CMC. What is the average CMC? It's pretty simple. You sum up all the costs of all your cards, so all the converted mana costs, the top right-hand corner of the card, and then you divide it by the number of cards in your deck that have a cost. So you're not going to include lands, for example, and that gives you your average CMC. Very simple. It's going to give you a number between most likely 1 and 3, and that's usually the average CMC that you're going for. Then, and I'll get to how that plays into your land count in a second. Then you also have the option of playing ramp spells in your deck. So ramp spells are spells, or sometimes creatures, that produce mana themselves or allow you to put an extra land on the battlefield, or go fetch a land and put it onto the battlefield. I usually assign a number to these cards, a value to these cards in terms of how much of a land are they worth. A lot of people do this. This is a slightly more advanced concept, but I think it was important to cover in this video. So for example, if you're playing a Birds of Paradise, which taps for mana, I usually count that as half a mana. And if you're playing an Arbor Elf, same thing, essentially, counts as half a mana. Growth Spiral and Explore, which are spells that allow you to potentially play an extra land on your turn, which is essentially ramping. I don't count them as highly as creatures, like Mana Dorks, like the ones I just covered, so I count them as a quarter of a mana. So if I'm playing 4 Growth Spirals, I'll count that as 1 mana, and that comes into play when I'm actually deciding how many lands I need in my deck. I might reduce that number by 1 if I'm playing, let's say, 4 Growth Spirals, or I might reduce that number by 2 if I'm playing 4 Arbor Elves. Again, this is more a guideline. This is not something you absolutely must follow. It's not even something I absolutely follow. If I'm playing 4 Birds of Paradise, I might only reduce my land count by 1. There's a lot of things that really go into it, but these are just, again, base guidelines that I use when I'm deciding on the amount of lands I'm going to play. All right, so what about the amount of lands that you play? In Modern, at least in many formats, you usually see anywhere between 15 and 24 lands. Some decks, very few decks, go less than 15. In Legacy, there are manaless dredge decks, for example, that play almost nothing. And there are some decks that play more than 24, usually control decks or Yorion decks. But majority of the decks that you see will probably hover between 19 and 21, 22 lands. What I have on the screen here is your chances of drawing a land card every time you draw a card from your deck. Now keep in mind, this is only a guideline. This is assuming you have all your 60 cards in your library. So the minute you draw your first 7 cards, these numbers will shift a bit. Depending on how many lands are in that 7 that you draw, these numbers shift a bit. So it's almost impossible to kind of give you what the true numbers are, because those true numbers change literally every time you draw a card, and depending on what that card is. But this is just basically a rough estimate of the odds of you drawing a land when you're playing the game based on the amount of lands that you have in your deck. Again, I want to be really clear here. For a lot of you that are beginners, there's a thing called variance in Magic. I have played plenty of games where I have 17 lands in my deck, and I go through 4 turns where I draw nothing but lands. And sometimes I play 22 lands, and I go through 4 or 5 turns where I don't draw any lands. This is variance, so just keep that in mind. These are just general guidelines. So take a look at those numbers. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they are pretty interesting in the sense that they'll tell you that, for example, the difference between 17 and 18 lands, not too huge, but again, this is just something to keep in mind when you're deciding on land counts, and maybe a base number you should start at, you know, when you're taking into account how many lands you actually need. So, you know, use that as you see fit. You'll also be using it with your average CMC, which is the next screen we're going to be seeing here. So generally speaking, if your average CMC is 1.5 or less, you could start at around 18 lands or less. And depending on the cost of your spells in your deck and how many of them you have, you may up that number or you may reduce that number. So for example, if your average CMC is 1.5 or less, but you have maybe 3 or 4 spells that are 4 mana, you might want to add maybe a 19th land as opposed to reducing it, because you do want to get to 4 mana at some point. And at 18 lands, you're only getting 1 in 3 to 4. You're only getting 1 land in every 1 or 3 to 4 cards, or 1 or 3 to 4 turns. So you might, you need to keep that in mind on how long you might have to wait to actually get to your 4th land. Again, these are just base figures. I can't stress enough how these are just base figures. If you're between 1.5 and 2 CMC, you could start around 20 lands in your deck and then work your way around that, and so on and so forth. Between 2 and 2.5, you up yourself to 22. 2.5 to 3, you get to 24, and then above 3, you choose how many more lands you need to add. But again, these are just basic numbers. If you're starting out with a new deck and you figure out what the average CMC is for most of the spells you want to play, these are numbers you start around. This is what I would do as a base when I'm building a deck, when I'm brewing a deck. This is the exact same base that I use, and then I adjust accordingly based on what the deck is trying to do, how many mana dorks I'm playing, so on and so forth. Alright, so I hope I haven't lost you there. Let's move on to Manabase Construction. So when I'm building my mana base and I'm deciding on the land count, which lands to play, these are the 3 things that are going through my mind. And these are the 3 things that go through most people's minds for most normal decks. Unless your deck is degenerate or doing something really weird that's not often going on in Magic. This is the 3 points that I always use, that I always stick to. And I've mentioned this in my deck text as I subscribe to what why my land choices are, or what my land choices are, I should say. So access to all colors at all times. My mana should allow me to access all the colors apart from basics, obviously. Should allow me to have access to all my mana that I need at all times. By that I mean the actual colors. So if I'm playing a 3-color deck, I should be able to relatively easily get access to all 3 colors within the first few turns, whether through using fetches or having enough shocks, to produce the mana that I need. I should have my mana base constructed in a way that I get everything that I need. The ratios of the colors in my deck are taken into account when I'm choosing the lands. So for example, if you're playing a 2-color deck where only maybe 5 spells are green and the rest are red, you're not going to be playing a 50-50 split in terms of mana production in your lands, right? You're not going to be having 50-50 red, 50-50 green, because that's not actually what your mana requirements are. You could, depending on what lands you're playing, but you adjust according to that. So that's what I mean by access to all colors at all times. Mana is accessible when played. Very important. This is why I'm usually very allergic to playing lands, either specialty lands that don't produce colors that I actually need. So a lot of specialty lands that don't produce any colors, but they do something else, outside of what a land normally does. Those I usually play in smaller numbers, so I don't play at all. But again, that's more a personal decision. But mana is accessible when played, meaning, shock lands, basics, those are lands that come into play and you could use them right away. You have a choice to use them right away, at least in shocks. I mean, basics come into play untapped all times. This is why, for example, I don't use check lands that often. I don't use fast lands that often, because they have a constraint that I don't necessarily always have control over. And when I want to play lands, I want to play my lands and play them right away, especially in the first 3-4 turns. In most formats, those are very pivotal. So if you play a land and you can't play it right away because it has some constraint, that could really hold you back if you needed it to cast a spell. So again, when I'm building a mana base, accessibility at all times and when played is in the back of my mind. And of course, pain balance. And by that I mean, at the end of the day, we can't just play 4 shocks, 20 fetches. You can't do that. Even if you had all the money in the world, I don't do it. and that's because you can't have a mana base that's too painful. Again, unless you're doing something special, your mana base has to have some sort of balance. This is why you often still play basics. This is why, depending on how many lands you're playing, you might still play fast lands and other check lands and lands that don't necessarily force you to lose life to produce mana that you need. So you have to find a proper balance between pain and consistency. And again, some decks, maybe it doesn't matter how much your mana base hurts, because maybe you're going to win in the first 3 turns, so it doesn't really matter. Other decks, it might matter a lot more, so keep that in mind. So I'm going to go through some samples here, again, for the basics of where I would start in certain configurations of decks. And I think you could use the next few options I'm about to show you as a template when you're building decks, or at least I hope that they're useful enough for you to use them as templates when you're building your own decks, and you'll adjust as you go on. So let's use this current example. So 19 lands, 2 colors, 75% of the cost of my spells are blue, the other 25% are red. So what am I looking at? This is how I would probably start. This would be the baseline of how I would start before I start testing. I would play 2 shocks. I often don't play more than 2 shocks, no matter what I'm doing for any particular color. So I won't play 3 steam vents. I'll play 2. I'll play 4 scalding tarns, because they're scalding tarn. I mean, it's on color. You get one of the 2 colors that you need. So important. I'll play 4 Spire Bluff Canal. Oh boy. Only because it's not as painful as the other options that you can play that I covered earlier on in this video. So Firely Islet as being one of them. So Spire Bluff Canals is going to be a necessary evil in this case. You could reduce the amount of Spire Bluff Canals and play other shocks, for example, that won't always be on color, but for example, you could play a Wooded Foothills, which gets you a forest or a mountain. Obviously, you can't get a forest here, but you could go get a mountain. You could play Misty Rainforest, which again gets you a forest and an island. Can't get a forest, but you get your island, or you get your steam vents. So you could cut down the amount of Spire Bluff Canals and increase your your fetch count, which is probably what I would do after building this base. But if budget is a concern or pain is a concern, then Spire Bluff Canal as a 4-of would make sense. Then Firely Islet, it's a pay 1 life to add 1 blue or 1 red. All right, so it's a pain land essentially in that instance. Or you could pay 1 and sacrifice it to draw a card. Especially in a blue-red spell, blue-red deck, you probably want to draw more cards to find more answers. So it's a nice little option there. If you do flood out, you can decide to sacrifice Firely Islet and draw a card. If you're not a fan of that, you could cut that out and play more fetches, like I said, or you could play more basics or play pathways instead. That would also be perfectly fine in a 2-color deck. Then you got 5 islands and 1 mountain to round out your numbers. Again, most of your spells are blue, so you want to probably have blue, more blue than red. Now, I'll give you a hint of what I mean about nuance and something that we won't cover in this video. But sometimes it's incorrect to have this split, even if 75% of your deck is blue and 25% is red. Although rare, I have to admit. Sometimes that may be the case, but your turn 1 spells, more often than not, might be red. And maybe the majority of your spells that are blue are turn 2, 3, 4, whatever. In that case, you might want to play an extra mountain, or playing a lot of blue basics might not be good, because then you might start games with more blue basics than not. And then you might have to mulligan a lot because you can't play anything turn 1. Probably doesn't happen in this configuration, but I just want to give you an idea of the complexities of Manabase Construction. Alright, so here we have a 3-color deck. So you're playing 20 lands in this 3-color deck. 75% of your spells are blue, 15% are red, 10% are green. So how would I construct my mana base, and my base mana base in this instance? So let's go. Let's start with the shock lands, or dual lands, I should say. I would still start with 2 steam vents, because you're playing more blue and red than green, so 2 steam vents would make sense. And then you have 1 breeding pool. Don't need to play more than 1 in this instance, and again, we want to do pain management here. And then I would round it off with 2 more Spire Bluff Canals, again, because you're playing more blue and red than you are green, most likely, based on these numbers. Then you would get to the fetches. So here I would play 4 Scalding Tarns. Obviously, I would play 4 Misty Rainforest as well, and 2 Wooded Foothills. For those of you who follow a lot of my deck text, my Temur Delver decks, for example, this would be a very similar mana base to what you would see there. So again, fetches-wise, you're playing 10 fetches. It is normal to sometimes play more fetches than lands you can fetch with. This is okay. It's very rare that you'll run into instances where you've run out of cards to fetch for. So just keep that in mind. So playing more fetches than lands you can fetch is normal. I'm just telling you from now. And then when it gets to basics, so I play 3 islands, 1 forest, and 1 mountain. Again, based on the amount of lands that we have access to or that we can play, these numbers make sense. I definitely would not play pathways in a 3-color deck because it just becomes a bit clunky and it takes away from your other efficiencies. Now, if you don't have the money or the budget for these many fetches, then you can definitely cut down on fetches. First of all, maybe play more Spybelf Canals or other fast lands, or maybe bump up your basic count. No, those are all options. You could play pathways if you really want to. That's also an option, again, if fetches are just really out of your range, but just keep in mind you would be reducing the efficiency of your mana base in that instance. So if you want to be the most efficient in this 3-color example, then this is where I would definitely start, and then I would adjust here and there, depending on, again, what nuances of your deck are. So you might not need a basic mountain, for example. You might need more basic islands, or you might need more basic forests. If, for example, the majority of your early turn spells are green, then you might want an extra forest in there to increase your chances of it being in your opening hand, if for whatever reason you don't have a fetch or something else there. Again, these are nuances that I'll get more into in an advanced video, but I think for beginners and people just getting a bit more comfortable with land construction, this is where I would start. I would hope that you would use these as your templates, using the numbers I gave you in the previous sections as your templates to start building your mana bases. That's really all I wanted to cover in this video. I didn't want to make it too long, and here I'm rambling off. So let me know in the comment section down below if this helped you. If it didn't, if a lot of people come back and say that they, this didn't help them, build better mana bases, then I will redo this video. Before I do the advanced video, obviously, I will redo this video taking in that feedback, because I really want this video to be useful to everyone. I don't want to just talk for 30 minutes. So I'll most definitely do an addendum to this video if a lot of people come back with feedback saying that it wasn't useful. But I really hope that it was. But please be honest. Let me know in the comment section down below what you thought. I really want to help others build decks. I want you all. It's what I'm Delver of Brews. I love brewing decks, but I share them because I'm hoping I inspire you to build your own decks. Building your own deck and having fun with it, whether you win or lose, it's definitely a great experience. It's a different experience from just playing a deck that others have built for you. I mean, I guess that's kind of what I'm doing. But I'm brewing decks that mostly come out of my mind, or variants of decks that exist. And I want others to do the same. I want you all to have fun. So I'm hoping this basic video gave you some insight into how land construction works. And yeah, stay tuned for more. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. It really helps out my channel a bunch. It really, really does. So I'd really appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook goes a really long way. Sharing my content on social media. Again, all of these things take a few clicks for you, a few seconds, but for me and the channel, it makes a ton of difference. It really is a night and day, so I really appreciate that. If you want to go a step further, join my Patreon community. It's growing every week, every month. It's growing, which I really appreciate, to no end. Check out the Patreon link in the description of this video. Check out the tiers. Basically, you get some of your money back at the end of every year in the form of magic cards. I send them all to you, but all that information is on Patreon. Thanks, and have a good one.